that up, and these 4 lines of reasoning are consistently used in the missionary presentations throughout the New Testament. And you can see this with Paul, okay? At the, I want to say Areopagus, but is that right? He was before the philosophical leaders of Athens, and they were right with him until he mentioned the resurrection. And it was a resurrection that made them balk. So Paul often used this. Okay, so now we're going to start a new section. And this section is on natural theology. And we'll define it and so forth, so I don't want to jump ahead of myself and do that now. So we're going to be looking at what is natural theology. So there are 2 kinds of revelation. The first revelation is the scriptures. And so we know there is a God because the Bible tells us that there is a God. He has revealed himself to us through the scriptures. But then there is natural theology. And here we see evidence of it. So in Romans chapter 1, it says, this happens because what can be known about God is evident among them, because God made it evident among them. In fact, his invisible characteristics, his eternal power and divine nature, have been clearly seen since the creation of the world, because they are understood from the things he made. As a result, people are without excuse. So that which can be observed can be studied scientifically. So notice it says, oops, if I hit the right button here, be clearly seen and made evident among them. His invisible characteristics have been clearly seen. So you can see these things. By studying creation, you can see these things about God. Therefore, in that sense, it's observable and can be studied scientifically. So, natural theology has its limitations. Natural theology, perceiving God from nature, can only tell us that a God of some kind exists. It can't tell us who, and can't identify him or anything like that. It tells us that he exists. It does not tell us that the triune God exists. So it's a little like this. Imagine that you're driving down the road and you see a nice house and you think, that's a beautiful house someone made. What does that house tell you about the builder? Okay, so skill, he might be a good builder. Okay. What else does it tell you about the builder? Maybe they're creative. This is probably the most obvious thing about the builder. He exists. So you look at that house and you think, wow, that's a great house. There's a builder that built it. But doesn't tell you who he is. Doesn't really tell you anything about him except he's good at building houses, maybe creative, other aspects, does good work, whatever it is. But from studying the house, you can't tell who he is. You know he exists. You know he's good at what he does, but who is he? Don't know. How would you contact him? Don't know. So his existence is the chief part. And so when we look at creation itself tells us that there is a creator. And we can look at his workmanship and go, wow. Talk about creative, talk about design. We're going to come into that topic here soon. We can be blown away with his workmanship. Don't know who he is, Don't know how to contact him. Certainly don't know how to be in relationship with him. Okay. So how, even though this natural theology has its limitations, that's not to say it's unimportant. Okay? In fact, natural theology can be very important in discussing things with those that deny God's existence or deny Christianity. Okay, does everyone hear the message? Okay, so you've got this idea. Well, I'll go back. It's carry on. So this happens because what's known about God is evident among them. So he's made it visible, and as a result, people are without excuse. And this is since the creation of the world. So this idea of God speaking to mankind through creation, proclaiming that that he exists. Well, the question is, does everyone hear it? Does everyone acknowledge it? So here, get back on this. In John 18:37, it says, "You are a king then," Pilate asked. Jesus answered, "I am, as you say, a king. For this reason I was born, and for this reason I came into the world to testify to the truth. Everyone who belongs to the truth listens to my voice." Does everyone listen to God? We'd have to say no. And if we kept reading in Romans, it talks about how they traded natural relations, sexual relations, for unnatural. They worship the created things rather than the Creator. So they didn't hear this voice of God proclaiming his existence through creation itself. So people can decide to turn a deaf ear to the testimony of God in nature. That is why some 10% of Americans now claim to be atheists. And that could be a low figure now, because I think I just read a statistic recently from a 2014 Gallup poll, and I think it was 19% of Americans believe in Darwinian evolution, and I think it's even termed atheistic Darwinian evolution. So that figure may be higher. Okay, does everyone hear the message? So again, but because I tell you the truth, you do not believe me. So again, Jesus said, I tell you the truth, you don't believe me. Some people reject God's revelation in nature and in his word simply because they reject the truth. They've chosen to believe lies instead. Again, in John 9, Jesus said, from the beginning of time, no one has ever heard... Sorry, this isn't Jesus. From the beginning of time, no one has ever heard of anyone opening the eyes of someone born blind. If this man were not from God, he could do nothing. They answered him, you are entirely born in sinfulness, yet you presume to teach us, and they threw him out. Threw him out of the synagogue. They excommunicated him. And so again, this man born blind, which was one of the miracles we mentioned last time, he sees this and he thinks, wow, no one has ever done anything like this. This Jesus must be the real deal. And when the synagogue rulers are questioning him, he responds, if this man were not from God, he could do nothing. And then they reject it. They reject the evidence. They had the parents come in and say, this is our son, and we know he was blind. How he sees, we don't know. He's of age, ask him. So they had all the evidence right there before them, and they just kept rejecting the evidence. Okay. Mike.
Was John not a Jew?
John was a Jew.
So why would they say to him that you were entirely born in sinfulness?
No, it's not to John, it's to the man born blind. So there was the synagogue rulers were interrogating the man born blind. And that's the one that Jesus spat, made mud, put the mud on his eyes and said, go wash in the pool of Siloam.
So that's not, they're not talking.
They're not talking to John, they're talking to that man who was born blind. Now, notice this statement here. You were entirely born in sinfulness. So that whole discourse started when the disciples asked Jesus, who sinned, this man or his parents, that he was born blind? This was a common understanding. He must have sinned in some way because he was born blind. And so they're following that same line of logic. And they reject what he says. He's telling them the truth. No one's ever heard of a miracle like this, and yet you're rejecting it. Doesn't he even say, do you want to come and worship him too? Something like that. But, so he did egg them on a little bit. Jesus' enemies didn't want to hear the truth. The evidence was right there before them, but they refused to listen. So it is now Romans 1. And we're not going to spend the time reading that, but you could read that whole discourse in Romans chapter 1 about them rejecting it. If you would, that video is a video discussion between Dennis Prager, a Jew, and you may have heard of Prager University. They put out a lot of good videos. They've got a great video on abortion and what it really is. Nothing graphic, but pictorial enough that it really... No, he's a Jew.
I know he is.
But he's not an Orthodox Jew. He would be Reformed Jew at best. But he does claim his Jewish heritage, and he'll speak Hebrew and so forth, so he still studies the Bible or the Old Testament. That's the discussion between Dennis Prager and Jordan Peterson on morality. It's an interesting discussion. Of course, I'm not going to endorse everything that they say, because particularly Peterson's morality is more based on pragmatism. This is what works. So if you want a healthy life, a successful life, these are the morals you should follow. So anyway, but this is what Prager said in it. I came to realize while at Columbia that everything being taught at Columbia was nonsense. He makes that statement in the video. Here he is at a pretty well-respected university, and he says, I came to realize it's all nonsense. And then he began searching. This is when he came to believe in God. So he believes in God, but does not make him a Christian. So natural knowledge has taught him, yes, there is a God, but he hasn't identified correctly identified who that true God is. So there are 4 arguments. So now we're going to look at 4 arguments, some in more detail than others, for the existence of God. Okay? And this is part of natural theology. So the first argument is the teleological or design argument. And we're going to spend quite a bit of time on that one. Then there's the moral argument, the cosmological argument, and the genetic entropy argument. So the design argument, and maybe I'll summarize them. So design, the idea is that the design we see in creation is too complex to come around by chance, to exist by chance. There must be an intellect behind it. Then the moral argument is that we all know right and wrong. And if we all know right and wrong, where does it come from? Who determines what right and wrong is? Doesn't matter where you go in the world, the same basic tenets of society are there. Where does that come from? And the idea is, C.S. Lewis says, if there's morals, then there must be a lawgiver. If there's laws, there must be a lawgiver. Cosmological argument is the idea of first cause. Okay? So to put something in motion, there must be something that causes that motion. And you go back to the first cause. So they would look at the Big Bang, where there's this, supposedly all the matter in the entire world was in a densely spinning mass about the size of a pinhead, and it blew up. The cosmological argument would say, well, who caused it, or what caused it to spin? How did it get energized that all the matter in the universe could be that concentrated? So it goes back to the first cause. Then the genetic entropy is an argument. John Sanford, Dr. John Sanford, is the one that really developed this. He's a world-renowned geneticist. And he said the secret in the world of genetics is that everything is getting worse, not better. In fact, they've now proven that within 4 generations in mankind, within 4 generations, there is measurable decline in the human genome. Okay? So we can now measure the decline of the human DNA. Okay? And the principle of Darwinism is that things are getting better. But genetics, not just in humans, but in all animals, all plants, all life, it is well known it's getting worse, not better. Genetic entropy. We'll talk about that one some too. We don't do much on the cosmological argument or the moral argument. This one because I have a section on natural law, which comes back into that one. But particularly this design argument is what we're going to look at today. Okay? So this is a bacteria, okay? And some bacteria have what's called a flagellum coming off the back of them, okay? And the flagellum is what the bacteria uses to move. Bacteria is a single-cell organism. It is considered one of the simplest life forms. And so it's seen by evolutionists, Darwinists, as a basic building block. The difficulty, though, is as we study these simple life forms, they become more and more complex. So this little tail off the end, which is essential for the bacteria to move, is this flagellum. The flagellum is a complex motor. Okay? It has a hook and filament, but here it has a sleeve, it has rotor. Let's get to this one. This one's clearer. So you've got this hook, you've got an L ring, P ring, a rod, an MS ring. Okay? These are clutches and brakes. The flagellum spins at 100,000 RPM. What's your car red line at? 2? No, it's higher than 2. Well, should be. Most cars will red line at around 7,500. Okay? 7,500 RPM. This flagellum, 100,000 RPM. Motorbikes, I think the top, like a sports motorbike, 22,000 RPM. So this is spinning 5 times faster than a sports bike motor can. It's incredible. The braking system, that flagellum spinning at 100,000 RPM can stop and reverse direction in under a second. It's just fascinating that this little tail on this single-cell organism has to have all of these unique parts for it to be able to function the way that it has to function. You take out the brake, you take out the clutch, you take out any of these things, it no longer works. The bacteria is disabled. So how could something so complex come about by chance? Can you imagine, for us to build an engine like this, we have to experiment again and again, and we even have starting points because we have knowledge about clutches and brakes and so forth. Okay? But we would have to run prototype after prototype until we finally got it right. Okay? How many prototypes would have to run for this to come from nothing? Just pure chance. It's astronomical. There is no way that something this complex can come about by chance. And this is on what we call a simple life form. So what about the more complex? Okay? This is a single cell organism. Large organisms have trillions of cells within them. And all of them operating differently within the organism itself. So each cell having its individual role in the larger organism. Okay. How are we doing for time-wise? We keep an eye on that. 26. I've got until 10:45, right? Good. Okay, so we've got another 15 minutes. I'm going to try and click on that video and get it to work. Okay, these videos here, what did it do? These videos are produced by a guy named Michael Behe, and this first video he'll introduce himself some. He's a biochemist, and he has produced a series of videos that range from, they're about 5 to 7 minutes long, and they're on intelligent design, or that's what they're getting at, intelligent design, complex design. If you got kids, or if you yourself want to look at them, they are fascinating. And he really shows the complexity of the world we're living in. But here's just an introductory one. Phil, can we get sound or what?
We also find magnificent structures in nature, and each of these living structures was also built by machines. Machines that are far more elaborate than anything that humans have ever built. Machines, they enable us to be creative and produce spectacular structures. We also find magnificent structures in nature, and each of these living structures was also built by machines. Machines that are far more elaborate than anything that humans have ever built. In fact, this log is currently being decomposed by tiny fungi that are vastly more complex than this drone. I'm Mike Behe. Welcome to the unseen world of organic micro-machines. Every living thing in the world is made of cells. Microbes are single-celled organisms. Advanced life forms have trillions of cells. Inside a cell is a bustling operation of interconnected molecular machinery so sophisticated it would put any modern high-tech factory to shame. This intricate machinery is what gives the cell its remarkable abilities to process energy, execute genetic instructions, and replicate, all with unbelievable efficiency. I'm a biochemist, a scientist who studies the molecules of life. There's never been a more exciting time to be a life scientist. This is a golden age of discovery in molecular biology. Stunning breakthroughs in our understanding of the most fundamental unit of life, the cell, have been coming faster and faster. My own view of the cell took a turn years ago. I was in the lab at the National Institutes of Health doing postdoctoral research. I was discussing the origin of life with a fellow postdoc. As she and I thought about the cell, we wondered how could its complex membrane, proteins, metabolism, genetic code, how could all that have formed by the accumulation of undirected changes? So we were both sort of stunned by the notion. But then we just laughed it off. We figured that even if we didn't know the answer, somebody must know. Well, in the 10 years after that, I didn't come across any science publications that adequately answered the nagging question, exactly how did the cell get to be so complex? Everything I read presumed that those biological mysteries would eventually be solved by Darwin's theory of evolution. Being an evolutionist myself, that was fine with me. Then I came across a book titled Evolution, a Theory in Crisis by geneticist Michael Denton. It addressed profound problems with Darwin's theory. It asked hard questions about the origin of life. And it showed that science didn't have the answers. No matter that everyone assumed it did, or assumed that it would eventually, or something. I was flabbergasted by the book. I began to look at biology with a fresh set of eyes, and I started asking questions, lots of questions. That's what this series is about, asking questions. Not about the why or when, but about the how of biological origins. As I said, there's never been a more exciting and fun time to be a biologist. So I'm really looking forward to jumping into this series, and I hope you'll join me.
Okay, so you can look at those other videos if you search Michael Behe, B-H-E, no, B-E-H-E, and you'll find all of his stuff. He particularly proposed what's called the Mousetrap Problem. And this has stumped, it's really stumped evolutionists for over a decade now. And if you watch his videos, towards the end, he proposes this mousetrap problem. Okay? And the mousetrap problem is this. It is something that is irreducibly complex. You can't take any of the parts away and still have the mousetrap function. And this was proposed to Darwinist evolutionists, and no one has been able to come up with a response to it. They'll try, they'll say things like, well, if an organism has parts that function in a certain way, if we add A and B, and then this X becomes no longer efficient, X can be taken away. But as they've argued and reasoned this out, this is within Darwinist evolutionists, okay? They're having to add all of these other subcategories. So it's no longer just add A, it's add A1, and then A2, and then A3, and then add B, and it gets more and more complex the way they're going because you can't take any away of the parts. And here's one of the chief things that this is why they're thinking of, okay? land-dwelling animals are supposed to have evolved from fish. And so the current thought is that the, what's it called, the air sac inside fish, which helps them control their buoyancy in water, that somehow that became lungs so that they could dwell on land. And so they're looking at the functions of an air sac and having to add all of these other functions so that the air sac can become lungs. The problem is that as they study the role of lungs, it becomes more and more complex. They have to add all of these other mechanisms that are essential for the lung to function properly and healthfully. And so as they're drilling down, it's not getting simpler, it's getting more and more complex. And so this idea of irreducible complexity is a key weakness in Darwinistic theory, where something cannot be reduced in its parts and still function. So Behe was the one that proposed this idea of irreducible complexity. I've covered that. Yeah. So his conclusion is Darwinian principles cannot produce major developments like this flagellum. Just, it's too complex. Darwin and his followers had no idea what a cell was like. So Ernst Haeckel, who was an apologist for Darwin, and you may have heard of Haeckel's embryos and seen the pictures. Haeckel's embryos are a proven hoax. Okay? Haeckel just drew the pictures to prove what he wanted them to prove. And the thought was this, that in the womb, or in an egg, everything starts out the same, and then as it develops, it takes on its unique characteristics. And well, now with modern photography and so forth, it is very clear that early on, there are marked differences between embryos. And now what we know with genetic code, from the beginning, that embryo for a horse has all of the genetic information for a horse, not a duck. And likewise in the womb for humans, in eggs for chickens, so forth. So they had no idea of the complexity. He said it's just a globule of protoplasm. It's just a blob. And yet now, with our modern understanding of cells, it's just like, wow. Okay? DNA was a breakthrough. That was just mind-blowing, that we've got this double helix of DNA and all this information. As we study the cell, we're finding more and more information in the cell. So you've got mitochondrial DNA in the, within the cell, which is usually only from your mother. And then the lining of the cell, they're now finding sugars on the lining of the cell, which are also coded information. And you saw a picture of the, I think it was depicted as red, sliding down a DNA chain. And what they're realizing is the coding on the outside of the cell is communicating with the DNA so that it locks onto the right part of the DNA so it has the proper function that it's intended to have. I mean, every little cell in your body is a very, very complex machine. And yet they thought it was a globule. They had no idea the complexity of life. Okay? So they just didn't have any idea about what a cell was really like. And so they could speak very flippantly about it. So here's a picture, a cross-section of a cell. I won't go into the details of it. Okay? But it's not just a blob. It is uniquely designed. And within a large organism, it is uniquely designed to be able to function in that specific spot of the organism. Your heart cells are performing a very different function than the cells in your big toe. And yet they have the same genetic information available to them. It's all being controlled by the body so that that cell functions in that particular role. So you can't even say all of the cells in your body are exactly the same. No, they're uniquely designed for that part of your body. And when they take on different roles, that's potentially what cancer is and so forth. There's cells that aren't functioning the way they're supposed to in the body. So there's the mitochondrion, and here's where you're getting your mitochondrial DNA. Another side note on that. From mitochondrial DNA, they know that everyone on the face of the earth is descended from one of three women. It will be referred to as mitochondrial Eve, and you think from that title that it's one person. Okay? But mitochondrial DNA has proven everyone by node. It's called nodes. There are three nodes. Okay? Two of them are potentially sisters. And when that was first released, it was an evolutionist that released it, and they said those women lived between 120 and 200,000 years ago. Well, they had no data on the rate of change of mitochondrial DNA at the time. Modern research is saying they maybe lived 12,000 years ago. Now, we would say that's still too long, but the point is, it's orders of magnitude less than the 120 to 200,000 years ago. Now they're saying 12,000. Maybe with more data, it'll get shorter still. Okay? So it's just fascinating, all of this information within the cell, within our bodies. And you have to ask, if there's information stored, what is required for information to exist? To rock information. What is required for information to exist? If you come across a piece of paper with a message written on it, what's required for that message to exist? Someone had to write it, yeah? Someone needs to read it, that's true. Peter? Language? True. There must be an intellect, right? Nowhere in creation do we observe information without an intellect behind it. Nowhere. So if there is information written in the DNA that is essential for life, the cell cannot exist without that information. There is a direct implication that there was a mind that wrote that information on the first DNA. The chance that that all came about by chance, or the probability that that all came about by chance is ridiculous. Okay? I think there's some stat I read recently where it's 10 to the power of 80,000. Okay? So that's 10 with 80,000 zeros behind it. And we'll say, well, something has a 1 in a million chance. 10 to the 80,000, that much or that little of a chance. It's just so complex that there's no way it came about by chance. That mind, there was a mind that put that first DNA together and created that first cell, if we're going to talk about first cells. So it's extremely complex. So bacteria is a single cell organism. Single cell is more complex than the car you rode in or drove to get here. Single cell is more complex than the car you rode in to get here. A single cell is more complex than the computer you used to write these words. The simplest single cell organism requires 10,000 bits of information to function, and that's from Stephen Meyer, another intelligent design guy. You can search for him. I think it's called Discovery Institute. I may have that on the next slide. Fascinating videos. Okay, so then a term to know, the purposeful arrangement of parts. The parts of an organism must not only be present, but purposefully arranged for the organism to function correctly. Okay? And we are 1 minute over, so I've got to wrap up right there. Okay? So we don't just have irreducible complexity, so you got the parts of a mousetrap, you got to have them all in the right place, otherwise it doesn't function. Okay? And that's another complex. We'll take that up next week. We don't have time for questions, so let's close with the singing of the doxol.